Part 1. Matsya Nyaya as a fundamental law of power, the illusion of order and the reality of predation. In the political philosophy of Kautilya, as articulated in the Arthashastra, Matsya Nyaya is not merely a metaphor. It is a structural diagnosis of reality. The phrase law of fishes describes a condition where the larger fish consumes the smaller fish in the absence of restraining authority. It is often misunderstood as a primitive observation about chaos. It is not. It is a precise articulation of how power behaves when constraints are weak, misaligned, or absent. The key error most readers make is assuming Matsya Nyaya only applies to a breakdown of governance. That interpretation is incomplete and strategically naive. Matsya Nyaya is not an exception condition. It is the default equilibrium. Governance isn't the natural state of society. It is an artificial imposition designed to suppress predatory incentives, remove enforcement, and the system reverberates instantly. But more critically, even when enforcement exists, it doesn't eliminate pressure. It merely distributes who is allowed to exercise. The state monopolizes violence internally, but this monopoly doesn't abolish predation, it centralizes it. Internal order as controlled predation. Without a functioning state, Matsya Nyaya doesn't disappear. It is reorganized. The ruler, without the mechanism of danda, becomes the sole legitimate wielder of coercion. This transforms chaotic predation into structured extraction. Taxation replaces looting, law replaces arbitrary violence, and bureaucracy replaces decentralized exploitation. However, the underlying logic remains identical. Those with power extract from those without it. The distinction isn't moral, it is structural. Internal governance doesn't eliminate the big fish, its small fish dynamic. It formalizes it into a system where extraction is predictable, regulated, and optimized for long term stability. The ruler prevents other predators from emerging not out of altruism, but to preserve monopoly over coercive capacity. This is consolidation of predation, not its abolition. The scaling problem from domestic order to interstate anarchy. The observation becomes decisive when scaling the framework upward. At the interstate level, there is no equivalent to there is no equivalent of a universal sovereign. No global danda exists that can enforce compliance across all states. As a result, the international system structurally resembles the pre-state condition described as Matsya Nyaya. This is not accidental, it is inherent. Each state operates as a sovereign predator within a larger ecosystem of competing predators. The absence of a higher authority ensures that the logic of Matsya Nyaya re-emerges at the macro level. Larger states or more capable states exert pressure on smaller or weaker ones. This pressure doesn't always manifest as outright conquest, it appears in more refined forms. Economic dependency, strategic coercion, alliance manipulation, and institutional capture. Thus, Matsya Nyaya is not confined to the collapse of governance, it persists even under conditions of strong internal order because the external environment remains unregulated. Internal strength amplifies a state capacity to behave as the larger fish externally. The strategic misinterpretation of strength. This is a persistent misconception that a well governed state exists outside the logic of predation. This is incorrect. A well governed state is not less predatory, it is more efficient at predation. Internal stability increases surplus generation, improves military organization, enhances administrative control, and strengthens intelligence capacity. These factors collectively increase the state's ability to project power outward. Kautilya doesn't advocate restraint as a moral virtue. He advocates restraint as a strategic calculation. Expansion isn't neglected, it is optimized. The Vijigishu, the, Vijik, the Vijigishu, the aspiring conqueror, is not driven by impulse but by conditional logic. Conquest is pursued only when the probability of success is high and the cost of control is manageable. This is not an ethical system, it is a system of calibrated opportunism. Why strong governance intensifies external Matsya Nyaya? When a state achieves internal coercion, it eliminates internal threats and frees up resources. These resources, economic, military, informational, must be deployed somewhere. If they are not absorbed internally, they are projected externally. This creates a paradox. The more stable a state becomes internally, the more capable it becomes of engaging in external competition. This is where Matsya Nyaya reasserts itself at scale. Strong states do not passively coexist with weaker ones, they assess them. They categorize them within the Mandala framework. They evaluate their vulnerabilities, alliances, and resource bases. The decision is not whether to dominate, but how to dominate with minimal cost. Direct conquest is only one option. Often, it is inefficient. More effective methods include indirect control, economic leverage, political manipulation, and alliance structuring. The objective is not territorial expansion alone, but control over outcomes. Mandala as a structured expression of Matsya Nyaya. The Mandala theory is the operationalization of Matsya Nyaya at an interstate context. It doesn't create competition, it maps it. The assumption that neighbors are enemies is not ideological, it is positional. Geographic proximity creates friction, competition over resources, overlapping security concerns. The enemy's neighbor becomes a potential ally not because of shared values, but because of aligned incentives. Matsya Nyaya explains why states compete. Mandala explains how that competition is structurally spatial. Intelligence doctrine explains how to manipulate that structure. The integration of these frameworks produces a system where predation is not random but strategically directed. Predation without collapse, the stability of controlled competition. A critical refinement is necessary. Matsya doesn't imply constant destruction. If every large fish consumed every smaller fish indiscriminately, the system would collapse. Kautilya recognizes it. Predation must be sustained. Overextension leads to administrative breakdown, fiscal strain, and internal rebellion. The predator becomes vulnerable. Therefore, the optimal strategy is not maximum expansion but maximum control with minimum exposure. This leads to layered systems of influence where weaker states are not destroyed but subordinated. They refrain nominal sovereignty while their strategic decisions are shaped externally. This is a more stable equilibrium than direct annexation. The persistence of hierarchy. What emerges from this analysis isn't chaos but hierarchy. Matsya Nyaya doesn't produce randomness, it produces stratification. At any given time, the system organizes itself into the tiers of power. Strong states dominate weaker ones, which in turn dominate even weaker entities. This hierarchy is dynamic but persistent. The absence of a global sovereign ensures that this hierarchy is constantly contested. However, the contest itself reinforces the structure. Each actor seeks to move upward in the hierarchy by increasing its relative power. This creates continuous competition but within a recognized pattern. Conclusion of Part 1. The non-negotiable logic of power. Matsya is not a warning, it is a baseline condition. Internal governance suppresses it locally but cannot eliminate it globally. Strong leadership doesn't negate it, it operationalizes it more efficiently. The idea that ethical governance can override structural incentives is not supported within Kautilya's framework. Power, when consolidated internally, seeks expression externally. The one question is the method, not the intent. If this logic is ignored, the outcome is predictable. A state that assumes cooperation will be reciprocated without regard to power asymmetry becomes a smaller fish. A state that fails to project strength externally invites encroachment. The system doesn't reward passivity, it relocates power away from it. Part 2. Integrating Matsya with Mandala, Shadgunya, and Uyapa. From isolated doctrine to unified strategic system, treating Matsya as a standalone idea is analytically weak. In the framework of Kautilya, it functions as the foundational assumption upon which all other doctrines in the Arthashastra are constructed. It defines the environment, a competitive system where actors seek advantage under conditions of incomplete constraint. The remaining doctrines, Mandala, Shadgunya, and Uyapa, are not independent theories, they are response mechanisms to that environment. If Matsya is the physics of power, the others are its engineering. Mandala theory as spatial encoding of predation. Mandala theory transforms the abstract logic of Matsya into a geopolitical map. It assigns role to state based on their positions relative to you. The immediate neighbor becomes the natural adversary because proximity creates friction, contested borders, overlapping resource claim, and mutual security concerns. The neighbor's neighbor becomes a potential ally because their incentives ally against your shared opponent. This is not diplomacy in the moral sense, it is geometry. States are nodes in the network where distance and adjacency determines probable conflict patterns. Mandala doesn't eliminate Matsya Nyaya, it channels it. Predation becomes directional. Instead of random competition, you get structured rivalry, predictable alliance formation. This predictability is what allows strategy to exist. Shadgunya as dynamic policy selection under pressure. Once the environment is mapped, the next problem is choosing action. Shadgunya, the six measures of foreign policy, provides a decision framework. Peace, war, neutrality, preparation, subordination, and dual policy are not ideological positions. They are conditional response determined by relative power. Under Matsya Nyaya, hesitation has a cost. If you misjudge your position, you either overextend or become vulnerable. Shadgunya exists to prevent both errors. It forces continuous reassessment. A weaker state may choose Sandhi, not because it values peace, but because it lacks capacity. A strong state may choose Vigraha, not because it seeks glory, but because conditions favor decisive action. Asana, often misunderstood as passivity, is a strategic delay, waiting for the balance to shift. The doctrine assumes that no position is permanent, power fluctuates, therefore policy must remain fluid. A state that locks itself into a fixed posture becomes predictable and predictability is exploitable. Uyapa as tactical execution of strategic intent. If Shadgunya determines what to do, Uyapa determines how to do it. Sama, Dana, Bheda, and Danda are not moral categories. They are cost structured instruments of influence. Each method represents a different level of resource expenditure at risk. Sama is the lowest cost, persuasion and negotiation. It works when incentives are already aligned or where target is uncertain. Dana introduces material incentives, shifting the cost benefit calculation of the target. Bheda exploits internal divisions, reducing the target coherence without direct confrontation. Danda is the highest cost, coercion and force used when other methods fail or when decisive action is required. The sequence is deliberate. You begin with with the least expensive method and escalate only when necessary. This minimizes resource depletion while maximizing control. Under Matsya Nyaya, resources are finite, and inefficient use of force weakens your position relative to other predators. The feedback loop between the doctrines. These doctrines aren't linear, they operate as a continuous feedback system. Matsya Nyaya defines the environment, Mandala identifies the structure of relationship within that environment. Shadgunya selects the appropriate policy given under certain conditions. Uyapa executes that policy. The outcomes then feedback into the system, altering relative power and forcing reassessment. For example, successful use of Bheda may weaken an enemy internally, shifting the balance of power. This may change your optimal policy from Sandhi to Vigraha. Conversely, a failed campaign under Danda may deplete your treasury, forcing a shift towards Asana or Samsaraya. The system is dynamic, not static. Control without conquest as the dominant strategy. Critical implication of this a critical implication of this integration is that direct conquest is rarely optimal. Under Matsya the objective is not destruction but dominance. Destruction eliminates a node from the system, but it also removes the potential source of extraction. Control, by contrast, allows continuous benefit. Mandala identifies which states are worth influencing. Shadgunya determines whether to engage directly or indirectly. Uyapa provides the tools to achieve influence without necessarily occupying territory. The result is a preference for indirect control mechanisms, tributary arrangements, dependent alliances, economic leverage, and political manipulation. This approach reduces administrative burden and minimizes the risk of rebellion. It also preserves flexibility. A subordinate state can be abandoned, replaced, or reconfigured without the cost associated with annexation. The role of information in system stability. None of this functions without accurate information. Kautilya places extreme emphasis on intelligence networks because miscalculation is the primary failure mode in a system governed by Matsya Nyaya. If you overestimate your strength, you engage in unwinnable conflict. If you underestimate your opponent, you miss opportunities for expansion. Intelligence reduces uncertainty, allowing more precise application of Shadgunya and Uyapa. It also enables manipulation of the mandala structure by influencing how other states perceive their positions. Information is not just a support function, it is a core component of power. The illusion of moral constraints. A recurring error is interpreting these doctrines through a moral lens. Kautilya doesn't deny the existence of ethics, but he subordinates them into survival and expansion. Under Matsya Nyaya, a state prioritizes moral consistency over strategic flexibility becomes predictable, and predictability creates vulnerability. This doesn't mean indiscriminate aggression, it means ethical considerations are conditional, not absolute. They are tools to maintain internal cohesion or external reputation, but they do not override the fundamental logic of power. Systematic consequences of ignoring integration. If a state isolates one doctrine and ignores the other, failure is likely. Relying on Mandala without Sadgunya leads to rigid alliances that cannot adapt to changing conditions. Rising Uyapa without accurate intelligence results in misapplied tactics. Pursuing Vigraha without considering treasury and internal stability leads to collapse. The system only works when all components are integrated. The integration is what allows a state to operate effectively within the constraints imposed by Matsya Nyaya. Conclusions of Part 2. Strategy as managed predation. What emerges is a coherent system where power is accumulated, deployed, and preserved through continuous adaptation. Matsya Nyaya ensures that competition never disappears. Mandala structures that competition. Shadgunya guides decision making. Uyapa executes strategy with calibrated costs. The outcome is not peace or chaos, but managed predation. States compete, but in ways that maximize advantage while minimize self-damage. Stability is not absence of conflict, it is the controlled expression of it. Part 3. Translating Kautilya into modern power systems, from ancient doctrine to contemporary architecture. The frames developed by Kautilya in the Arthashastra are not artifacts of a pre-modern world. They persist because they described invariant structural conditions, competing under decentralized authority, asymmetry of capability, and continuous recalibration of alliances. What changes across time is not logic, but the instruments and domains through which that logic is executed. The modern system doesn't invalidate Matsya Nyaya, it multiplies its vectors. The expansion of the battlefield from territory to systems. In Kautilya's environment, territory, treasure, and army were the domain variables. In modern systems, they remain relevant but no longer sufficient. Power now operates across interconnected systems, financial networks, technological infrastructure, supply chains, information ecosystems, regulatory regimes. The consequence is that Matsya Nyaya is no longer confined to physical conquests. It operates through a systemic control. A state no longer needs to annex territory to dominate it. Control over payment systems, access to capital markets, technological standards, or energy flows can produce equivalent or greater leverage. The larger fish is no longer defined solely by land or population, but by network centrality, its position with critical global systems. Modern mandala, network topology instead of geography. Mandala theory assumed geographic proximity as the primary determinant of conflict. In modern system, proximity is redefined. Two states may be geographically distant but economically interdependent, technologically integrated or strategically misaligned. The mandala evolves from a spatial circle into a multi-layered network. A state neighbor is now an actor whose actions materially affect its security or economic stability. This includes not only states but cooperation, financial institutions, and even non state networks. The enemy's neighbor may be a country, a trade bloc, or a technological ecosystem. Alliances are no longer binary, they are issue specific and domain specific. The complexity increases both opportunity and risk. It allows more avenues for influence, but it also creates more points of vulnerability. The modern mandala is not a circle, it is a web, and control depends on understanding its structure. Shadgunya in a multi domain environment. The six measures of foreign policy remain applicable, but their expansion. The six measures of foreign policy remain applicable, but their expressions have expanded. Peace is no longer limited to the absence of war. It includes economic agreements, regulatory harmonization, and technological cooperation. War is not limited to military conflict. It includes sanctions, trade restrictions, cyber operations. Neutrality becomes strategic ambiguity across multiple domains. Preparation includes not only military mobilization but also supply chain resilience, technological development. Seeking protection may involve aligning with a dominant financial or security architecture. Dual policy becomes standard practice as states cooperate in some domains while competing in others. The key shift is that multiple policies can operate simultaneously across different systems. A state may be in economic partnership with another while engaging in strategic rivalry in technology or security. This layered application of Shadgunya increases flexibility but also requires precise coordination. Uyapa as modern instruments of influence. The four methods of influence have expanded into sophisticated toolkits. Persuasion now includes narrative shaping through media, diplomacy, cultural projection. Incentives extend to trade agreements, investment flows, development financing. Division is executed through information operations, political influence campaigns, and exploitation of internal fractures within rival systems. Coercion includes not only military force but also sanctions, financial restrictions, and control over critical infrastructure. The sequence logic remains intact. Low-cost methods are preferred, escalation is controlled, and force is used selectively. However, the scale and speed of these operations have increased. Information can be disseminated globally in real time. Financial pressure can be applied instantly, and technological dependencies can be leveraged continuously. Intelligence as the core integrator. In a system of this complexity, intelligence becomes the central integrating function. It is no longer limited to espionage in the traditional sense. It includes data analysis, economic monitoring, technological assessment, and behavioral prediction. The objective is not only to reduce uncertainty but to reshape the perceptions of other actors. Control over information allows a state to influence how others interpret their own position within the system. This can alter their policy choices without direct coercion. Misperception becomes a tool. A state that can manipulate expectations can achieve outcomes that would otherwise require force. Economic statecraft as the primary arena of Matsya Nyaya. Economic systems have become the dominant arena where Matsya Nyaya is expressed. Control over currency system, trade routes, resource flows allow states to exert pressure without overt conflict. The dependency becomes strategic vulnerability. A state that relies on another for critical inputs, energy, technology, capital can be influenced or constrained. This creates a hierarchy where states compete to occupy central positions within global systems. Peripheral states become dependent, while central states extract value. The logic is identical to the original formulation of Matsya Nyaya, but the mechanism is more abstract. Instead of physical consumption, there is a systematic extraction. Technology as a force multiplier. Technological capability amplifies all other forms of power. It increases efficiency in resource extraction and enhances military capacity and enables new forms of influence. It also creates new dependencies. States that control key technologies can set standards, restrict access, and shape the development of paths of others. This introduces a new dimension of Mandala. Technological ecosystem becomes spheres of influence. States align not only based on geography or politics but on compatibility of system. This creates clusters that function as extended networks of power. The persistence of hierarchy in globalized systems. Globalization doesn't eliminate hierarchy, it obscures it. Independence creates the appearance of mutual benefit that the distribution of gain is uneven. States with greater control over critical nodes capture disproportionate value. This reinforces their position and allows them to expand influence further. The system stabilizes around these hierarchies or the stability is conditional. Shifts in technology and economic structure or political alignment can disrupt the balance. When this happens, Matsya Nyaya reasserts itself more aggressively as states compete to re-establish position. The cost of misreading the system. A state that falls a state that fails to recognize these dynamic risks becoming structurally dependent. If it assumes that interdependence guarantees security, it may neglect the need to control critical systems. This creates vulnerability. Once dependency is established, reversing it is costly and time consuming. Conversely, a state that overestimates its autonomy may engage in actions that trigger coordinated responses from stronger actors. Miscalculation either leads to subordination or overextension. The system doesn't tolerate persistent error. Conclusion of Part 3. The continuity of power logic. The transition from ancient to modern doesn't alter the fundamental logic described by Kautilya. Matsya Nyaya persists because the conditions that generated competition, asymmetry, and absence of overarching authority persist. What changes is the medium through which power is exercised. The modern state operates in a more complex environment, but the underlying principles remain. Control over system represses control over territory as a primary objective. Influence replaces conquest as the preferred method. Intelligence and adaptability become the decisive factors. The system rewards those who understand the structure, penalizes those who misinterpret it. The logic isn't negotiable, it is structural. Part 4: Failure, Overreach, and Collapse within Matsya Nyaya. The inevitable reversal, why dominance contains its own fragility. In the framework of Kautilya as articulated in the Arthashastra, the system governed by Matsya Nyaya doesn't produce permanent winners. It produces temporary concentrations of power. Every dominant actor operates under the same structural pressure it exploits. The larger fish consumes the smaller one, but in doing so, it increases its own visibility, exposure, and vulnerability. Dominance is not a stable endpoint, it is a phase. The critical error of powerful state is assuming that accumulation equals security. In reality, accumulation increases the number of adversaries, the scale of commitments, and the complexity of control. Each additional layer of influence creates new failure points. The system punishes those who cannot manage this complexity. Overextension as the primary failure mode. The most common path of collapse is overextension. Expansion, whether territorial, economic, or systematic, requires resource to sustain. Military occupation demands administrative capacity. Economic influence requires continuous capital flows. Technological dominance requires constant innovation. When expansion outpaces the ability to maintain it, the structure begins to fracture. Overextension manifests in multiple ways. Fiscal strain reduces the ability to fund both internal stability and external operations. Military commitments stretch forces thin, reducing responsiveness. Administrative overload creates inefficiencies and corruption. Information asymmetry increases as the system grows, making accurate decision making more difficult. Kautilya repeatedly emphasizes that conquest without consolidation is self-destructive. The Vijigishu must calculate not only the cost of acquisition but the cost of retention. Failure to do so transforms strength into liability. Internal decay, the silent erosion of power. External pressure is rarely the initial cause of collapse. Internal decay precedes it. As power consolidates, incentives within the system shifts. Elite compete for access to resources. Corruption increases as oversight weakens. Administrative efficiency declines. The connection between the ruler and the population deteriorates. This internal weakening reduces the effectiveness of the Saptanga elements. The treasury becomes strained. The army loses cohesion. Ministers pursue personal gain, and public support erodes. At this point, the state remains outwardly powerful but internally fragile. It becomes a large fish with a weakening structure. Matsya Nyaya then reactivates internally. Subordinate actors, regional elites, economic groups, or institutional factions begin to behave as independent predators. The centralized control that suppressed internal competition breaks down. Coalition formation, the counter to dominance. As the external level, the primary constraint on a dominant actor is coalition formation. Other states recognize the threat posed by concentration of power and align to counterbalance it. This is not driven by ideology, but by survival. The Mandala structure adjusts dynamically, with former rivals becoming temporary allies. Coalition impose costs on the dominant scale. They increase the number of fronts, complicate strategy, and reduce effectiveness of unilateral action. Even if the dominant states retain superior capabilities, the combined pressure can neutralize its advantage. The failure occurs when the dominant state underestimates the willingness or capacity of others to coordinate. This miscalculation leads to engagements that exceeds the ability to manage. Information failure, miscalculation as collapse trigger. In a system dependent on continuous reassessment, accurate information is critical. When intelligence systems degrade, the state begins to operate on flawed assumptions. It may overestimate its strength, underestimate its adversaries, or misinterpret the intentions of others. Information failure often results from internal decay. Corrupt officials distort reports to protect their positions. Fear of punishment discourages honest assessment. Decision makers become isolated from reality. The result is strategic blindness. The blindness leads to decisions that accelerate collapse. Wars are initiated under false assumptions, alliances are misjudged, resources are allocated inefficiently. Once these errors compound, recovery becomes difficult. Economic fragility and system dependency. Modern expression of Matsya Nyaya introduces an additional layer of vulnerability: systematic dependence. States that achieve dominance through control networks of financial, technological, or logistical systems become dependent on the stability of these networks. Disruption in one part of the system can cascade. Economic fragility emerges when the state's power is tied to a continuous flow of capital, trade, and information. If these flows are interrupted, the system destabilizes. Adversaries can target these dependencies, exploit them without direct confrontation. This creates a paradox. A more integrated and central a state becomes, the more efficient it is in extracting value, and the more exposed it is to systematic shocks. Legitimacy erosion and loss of compliance. Power isn't sustained by coercion alone. It requires a degree of compliance from those being governed or influenced. While legitimacy erodes, compliance decreases. This creates an increasing cost of maintaining control. Internally, loss of legitimacy leads to unrest, resistance, and reduced productivity. Externally, it weakens alliances, encourages direction, encourages defection. Subordinate state or actors begins to reassess their position, seeking alternatives that offer better terms. Legitimacy is not purely moral, it is functional. It reduces the need for constant coercion. When it disappears, the system becomes more resource intensive to maintain. The collapse sequence. Collapse rarely occurs as a single event, it is a sequence. Internal decay reduces efficiency, overextension strains resources, information failure leads to miscalculation, external coalitions increase pressure, economic fragility amplifies shocks, legitimacy erosion reduces compliance. These factors interact, accelerating the decline. At a certain point, the system reaches a threshold where it can no longer sustain itself. Control mechanisms fail, the state loses its ability to enforce order internally or project power externally. Matsya Nyaya reassesses itself fully. The once dominant actor becomes vulnerable to predation by others. Revision to the baseline condition. The collapse of the dominant state doesn't eliminate the system, it resets it. Power redistributes among remaining actors. New hierarchies emerge. The process repeats. Matsya Nyaya ensures that no configuration is permanent. This cyclical nature is central to Kautilya's framework. Stability is temporary, contingent on continuous adaptation. Failure to adapt results in replacement. Conclusion of Part 4: Power as a managed instability. The system described by Kautilya is not designed to procure equilibrium in the conventional sense. It produces managed stability. States rise, expand, consolidate, and decline. This objective is not to escape this cycle but to navigate it more effectively than others. Dominance requires constant recalibration. Internal strength must be maintained, external pressure must be managed, and information must remain accurate. Any lapse creates opening for competitors. Matsya doesn't reward penance. Matsya doesn't reward permanence. It rewards those who sustain advantage longer than others. The moment a state assumes its position is secure, it begins to lose. Part 5: Decision Framework and Applied Models of Kautilyan Strategy. From theory to execution, converting doctrine into decisions. The doctrines of Kautilya in the Arthashastra only become relevant when translated into repeatable decision processes. Without this transition, Matsya Mandala Shadgunya, and Upa, Uyapa remain descriptive rather than operational. The system assumes that actors are continuously evaluating their positions, recalculating advantage, and reallocating resources. What follows is not a moral framework or philosophical reflection, it is a decision architecture designed to function under conditions of competition and incomplete information. The core decision loop, continuous strategic recalibration. At the center of Kautilyan logic is a recursive loop. The actor begins to the actor begins by assessing internal capacity through Saptanga elements: leadership quality, administrative efficiency, economic strength, military capacity, territorial stability, and alliance reliability are evaluated not as abstract qualities but as constraints of action. The assessment is not static, it must be updated continuously because internal decay can occur without immediate visibility. Once internal capacity is assessed, the actor maps the external environment using the mandala structure. This is not a fixed map but a shifting topology of relationships. Each external actor is categorized based on relative positions, capability, and incentive alignment. The purpose is not classification for its own sake, but to identify pressure points and opportunities. The third stage is policy selection through Shadgunya. Based on relative balance of power, the configuration of the mandala, the actor selects a posture. This selection is conditional and reversible. It is not a commitment but a temporary alignment of strategy with current conditions. The fourth strategy is execution through UYAPA. The chosen policy is implemented using the least costly methods capable of achieving the objective. Escalation is controlled. Resources are preserved wherever possible. The outcome of this execution feeds back into the system, altering both internal capacity and external relationships. This loop operates continuously. There is no terminal state. Stability is a temporary outcome of successful iteration. Applied Model 1. Expansion Decision Framework. The decision to expand whether territorially, economically, or systematically is not based on ambition alone. It is a calculation of expected net gain under uncertainty. The actor evaluates the target across multiple dimensions. The first dimension is vulnerability. Internal divisions, weak leadership, economic stress, and unreliable alliances increase the probability of successful intervention. The second dimension is value. Strategic location, resource base, network position determines the potential benefit, and the third dimension is cost. Military expenditure, administrative burden, and the risk of resistance defines the resource committed on this issue. These variables are not independent. High value targets often come with high costs and strong defenses. The decision emerges when comparing expected gain with expected cost, adjusted for uncertainty. If the margin is insufficient, expansion is deferred. If the margin is favorable, action is initiated. Crucially, expansion doesn't default to conquest. Internal control is often superior. Influence over decision making, economic dependence, or alliance structure can produce equivalent benefits with lower costs. This framework therefore prioritizes control over ownership. Applied method 2. Conflict selection and timing. Conflict is treated as a tool, not as a default condition. The decision to engage in a conflict depends on timing relative to the opponent state. The actor monitors indicators of weakness, internal instability, economic disruption, leadership transition, or external distraction. These indicators reduce the opponent's ability to respond effectively. Simultaneously, the actor evaluates its own readiness. Military preparedness, logistical capacity, and domestic stability must be sufficient to sustain engagement. If both conditions align, opponent weakness and internal readiness conflict becomes rational. If either condition is absent, alternative strategies are preferred. Timing is decisive. Premature action wastes resources. Delayed action allows the opponent to recover. The optimal window is narrow and requires accurate intelligence to identify. Applied method 3. Alliance engineering. Alliances are not treated as fixed commitment but as temporary alignment of interests. The actor identifies states whose incentives can be shifted. This involves analyzing their threat perceptions, resource dependencies, and internal pressures. Incentives are then recalibrated to alter their positions within the mandala. The objective is not simply to gain allies but to reshape the network. Weakening an opponent's alliance can be as effective as strengthening one's own. This is achieved through selective incentives, information manipulation, or exploitation of existing tensions. Alliance engineering is dynamic. As conditions change, alliances are re-evaluated. A former ally may become a competitor if interests diverge. Flexibility is essential. Applied Model 4. Internal stability management. External success is contingent on internal stability. The actor must maintain coherence across the Saptanga elements. This requires continuous monitoring of elite behavior, economic performance, public sentiment. Deviations are corrected early to prevent escalation. The key principle is preemption. Political sources of instability are identified before they become active threats. This may involve redistributing resources, constructing institutions, or neutralizing dissent. The objective is not to eliminate all conflict but to prevent it from reaching a level that disrupts external operations. Internal stability is not a passive condition, it is actively maintained through constant adjustments. Applied Model 5. Information Control and Perception Management. In a system where decisions are based on perception as much as reality, controlling information becomes a strategic priority. The actor seeks to shape both its own understanding of the environment and the understanding of others. This involves collecting accurate data while simultaneously influencing how that data is interpreted by external actors. Perception management can alter behavior without direct intervention. If an opponent believes it is weaker than it is, may adopt a defensible posture. If it believes an alliance is unreliable, it may withdraw support. These shifts can be induced through controlled dissemination of information. The effectiveness of this model depends on credibility. Repeated exposure to accurate signals increases trust, making future manipulation more effective. Applied Model 6. Resource allocation under constraint. Resources are finite and their allocation determines long-term viability. The actor must balance investment across competing domains: military capability, economic development, technological advancement, and administrative capacity. Overinvestment in one domain at the expense of others creates imbalance. This allocation decision is guided by marginal return. Resources are directed towards areas where they produce the greatest increase in relative power. This requires continuous evaluation of both internal performance and external competition. Inefficient allocation reduces competitiveness over time. Efficiency is therefore not optional, it is a condition for survival. Applied Model 7. Exit and enrich and retrenchment strategy. Kautilya's strategy includes not only expansion but withdrawal. When conditions change and a position becomes unsustainable, the actor must disengage without triggering collapse. This requires preserving core capabilities while relinquishing peripheral commitments. Re-entrenchment Retrenchment is often misinterpreted as weakness. In this framework, it is reallocation of resources to maintain long-term advantage. The key is to exit in a way that minimizes losses, and preserves flexibility for future action. Failure to disengage leads to overextension and accelerates decline. System integration, the operational matrix. These models do not function independently. They are integrated into a single operational matrix where decisions in one domain affect outcomes in others. Expansion affects resource allocation. Alliance shifts alter conflict dynamics. Internal instability constrains external action. Information flows influence all decisions. The actor's task is to manage these interactions without losing coherence. This requires discipline in execution and accuracy in assessment. Errors compound quickly in a system with high interdependence. Final conclusion: strategy as structured adaptation. The applied methods derived from Kautilya framework do not provide certainty, they provide structured adaptation. The environment remains competitive and unpredictable. Success depends on the ability to process information, adjust strategy, and execute decisions with precision. Matsya Nyaya ensures pressure never disappears. Decision frameworks determine how effectively that pressure is managed. Actors that fail to apply these frameworks become reactive, responding to events rather than shaping them. In a system governed by competition, reactivity leads to subordination. The outcome isn't determined by intent but by execution. The system rewards those who can convert understanding into action without delay or distortion.